Have you ever thought about a world where just the threat of a big bill could actually stop tanks? Or, quiet down the noise of a coming war?
It really does sound like something out of a geopolitical thriller, doesn't it? High-stakes boardroom drama meets international conflict.
Exactly, but this isn't fiction. We're diving deep today into something pretty bold, frankly, surprising that's unfolding in international politics.
We're talking about the strategic use of economic tools,
Yeah.
specifically tariffs, and how they're being used to shape global peace in, well, really unexpected ways.
It's a fascinating pivot, isn't it? I mean, for decades, talk about preventing conflict usually circled around diplomacy, military power, maybe sanctions.
Right, the usual toolkit.
Eh.
But what we're looking at today is a different kind of leverage. It kind of trades bullets for balance sheets, you could say.
And this idea really jumps out with a pretty striking claim made by former U.S. President Donald Trump.
Ah, yes, that claim.
He asserted that using trade policy strategically, tariffs in particular, was a total game changer during his term. He said it averted or resolved, what was it, 7 potential wars?
7, yeah. And 4 of those he directly credits to this economic pressure, this specific tactic.
His words were pretty blunt about it, too.
Yeah.
He reportedly said something like, if you go fight and want to kill everybody, that is okay, but I am going to charge you each a 100% tariff when you trade with us.
And then,
They all gave up. That's what he said. It's a stark claim, suggesting economic power can sometimes just override military plans.
that certainly presents a different calculus for conflict.
And look, this isn't just political talk. It's a real strategy with real effects that, could actually affect you.
That's right.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack this whole thing piece by piece. We'll start with a quick refresher on what tariffs actually are.
Good idea. Lay the groundwork.
Then we'll get into the details of Trump's specific claims, check them against various sources, and then shift to how this exact approach is playing out right now, like in the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Because it is being used now. It's not just historical.
Exactly. We want to help you make sense of how these huge global decisions might filter down and, well, maybe even impact your daily life.
It's really about understanding the mechanics, isn't it? How these powerful economic levers get pulled and what the real impact is, often indirectly on the world stage.
So let's start with Tariffs 101, because understanding this is key to everything else.
Right.
Most people probably think of tariffs as just, that extra cost on imported stuff, basically a tax on goods coming into the country from somewhere else.
Yeah, like a cover charge at a club, maybe? Pay up to get your goods onto the shelves?
That's a good way to put it. But what's really interesting is how this, everyday economic tool is now being used as a diplomatic weapon. A pretty powerful one.
Definitely. Governments traditionally use them for a few reasons. Protecting domestic industries is a big one. Raising revenue is another.
Sure.
Or, as you just said, using them as these heavy bargaining chips in high-stakes diplomacy.
And it's not exactly new, especially in the U.S., right? I mean, tariffs were a huge source of federal income way back in the 1800s, long before income tax was the main thing.
That's true. It's an old tool. But applying it quite like this, as a primary peacemaking tool, that feels like a modern twist.
We really saw them make a comeback during Trump's first term, 2017 to 2021. He put tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, remember, using Section 232.
Right, citing national security concerns. That hit major trading partners hard: Canada, Mexico, China. It led to some really intense negotiations.
And one big result from that time was the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, replacing NAFTA.
The idea being sort of rebalance trade, and, supporters argued, bring jobs back to the U.S. It was clear trade policy was being used for a much wider agenda then.
But the core question for us today is this. Can tariffs actually be a nonviolent weapon for peace? Trump argues yes, that by threatening or hitting countries with high tariffs, even 100%, he forced warring sides to back down.
He literally said, "We are taking trillions of dollars in tariffs and stopping wars due to tariffs."
It really makes you pause, doesn't it? In a world that's pretty tired of military interventions, could this kind of aggressive economic approach actually work as a deterrent?
That's the billion-dollar question, really. It sounds almost too neat. Slap on a tax, tanks stop. But the reality, as always, is way more complex.
Trump often mentions stopping 7 conflicts, but he hasn't always listed them all out clearly.
No, it's been a bit vague sometimes.
So we've kind of pieced together the likely candidates from his statements, public records, focusing on those 4 he directly linked to tariffs and trade pressure.
And it's important to remember, these aren't always full-blown invasions. Sometimes it's about escalating tensions that could have exploded into wider conflicts.
Yeah,
So even defining war averted is part of this whole thing.
good point. Okay, let's dive into case one. India-Pakistan tensions,
Mhm.
specifically around the 2019 Pulwama crisis. Things were incredibly tense then.
Extremely. February 2019, a suicide bombing in Kashmir kills 40 Indian paramilitary personnel. India blamed Pakistan-based militants.
India hit back with airstrikes. Pakistan shot down an Indian jet. You had two nuclear powers right on the brink. The whole world was watching.
And Trump repeatedly said his administration stepped in, mediated, claimed he stopped a war between them.
Now, the tariff link here is pretty interesting. The U.S. had already put tariffs on Indian steel and aluminum back in 2018. India had retaliated with its own duties on U.S. goods.
Right, so amidst this military crisis, U.S. diplomats were pushing for de-escalation, and they had this existing economic leverage in their back pocket.
So if you look at analyses, say, from the Council on Foreign Relations, they point to back-channel talks, mutual deterrence playing key roles, standard diplomacy.
Sure, but they also note Pakistan's economy was already shaky, relying on U.S. aid and trade. That economic pressure likely made concessions seem, well, more palatable.
So the tariffs weren't like a direct weapon in the crisis, but more like a heavy nudge, making the cost higher.
Exactly. Less about tariffs stopping the war cold, more about creating an economic incentive to pull back alongside the diplomacy. No full war happened, but obviously tensions remain.
That really shows how tariffs can be an indirect lever. What about situations where the U.S. economic ties aren't quite so direct? Let's look at the Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh.
Yeah, a decades-old dispute. It flared up badly again in 2020. Heavy fighting, thousands killed.
And Trump recently talked about resolving it, saying others, including Russia, had failed for like 37 years. He claimed the leaders never thought this would be solved.
Now, tariffs here are trickier. The U.S. isn't a huge direct trade partner for either country, so direct tariffs on them aren't the main story.
So how would the economic pressure work?
Well, you could look at broader sanctions or trade pressure on, say, arms suppliers.
Hmm.
Turkey, for instance, is a key ally of Azerbaijan. Pressuring Turkey economically could have had an indirect effect. A ceasefire did eventually hold in 2023.
Okay, so more like secondary pressure. What do experts say? The Brookings Institution suggests U.S. involvement was actually quite limited. Russia brokered the main ceasefire deal.
True, but Trump's team was involved in pushing for talks. And it's plausible that just the threat of wider economic isolation or pressure on their allies like Turkey might have sped things up. It fits the general strategy of making conflict more costly.
So in India-Pakistan, it was more direct leverage. Here, it's potentially the shadow of broader economic consequences, a different mechanism.
Exactly. It shows the flexibility or maybe the ambiguity of the strategy.
Let's shift from regional flare-ups to a global nuclear threat. The North Korean nuclear standoff around 2017-2019.
Oh yeah, the fire and fury days. Missile tests, threats flying back and forth. Tensions were unbelievably high.
Trump met Kim Jong-un 3 times, famously, and claimed those meetings averted war.
Right. Now, tariffs here were used, but indirectly, mostly through pressure on China.
China being North Korea's main lifeline economically.
Precisely. So in 2018, the U.S. hit China with tariffs, up to 25% on lots of goods, as part of that wider trade war. The thinking was this would indirectly squeeze Beijing to put more pressure on Pyongyang to back down on its nuclear program.
Did it work? The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace credits the diplomacy, the talks themselves, with lowering the temperature. But they also note the tariffs really strained U.S.-China relations without actually getting North Korea to denuclearize fully.
So progress kind of stalled. But crucially, no hot war broke out, which was the immediate fear.
It suggests maybe tariffs can push a major power like China to apply some pressure, but they don't always achieve the ultimate goal directly, like denuclearization.
That's a key point. Tariffs can shift incentives, create friction, give you leverage. But they aren't some magic wand, especially for deeply entrenched issues like nuclear ambitions.
Okay, then there's the fourth case, the U.S.-China trade war itself. Trump often framed that as a kind of war that was being managed or averted from becoming worse through tariffs.
Right. He claims that by imposing tariffs, potentially reaching, 145% on some Chinese goods by 2025, according to some plans, he prevented a more direct military clash over hotspots like Taiwan or the South China Sea.
Vice President J.D. Vance echoed this recently, didn't he? Mentioning the current 54% tariff on China, linking it directly to this broader leverage strategy.
He did. Now, the economic cost domestically was real. The Tax Foundation estimated those tariffs cost U.S. households around $1,300 a year, though they did seem to boost domestic manufacturing a bit.
And did it prevent a military conflict? Well, no hot war happened, but outlets like Al Jazeera report that tensions between the U.S. and China are still incredibly high.
So calling the trade war itself a war averted might be, well, a specific framing. The economic conflict itself was pretty intense.
It really feels like a case where economic conflict became maybe a substitute for, or at least ran parallel to, military tensions.
Perhaps seen as the lesser of two evils, when the alternative is unthinkable kinetic warfare between major powers.
Now, what about the other three wars you mentioned? The list gets a bit fuzzy here.
It does. Possibilities include the Kosovo-Serbia border tensions. There, U.S. brokered economic agreements in 2020 helped normalize ties, though not really through tariffs specifically.
Okay, what else?
Maybe the campaign against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. Trump inherited that fight but claimed decisive victory. Or perhaps the Afghan peace talks that led to the 2021 withdrawal, framing the end of that long war.
Sources like Reuters do confirm Trump played a role in some de-escalations, but critics, often cited by places like CNN, argue he overstated his sole impact, pointing to multilateral efforts.
Yeah, the consensus seems to be that pinning these outcomes solely on tariffs is often a stretch. It was usually a mix of diplomacy, existing pressures, and yes, sometimes economic leverage played a role, but wasn't always the decisive factor.
So it's complicated, but what's really striking is that this isn't just looking back. This playbook is absolutely being used right now.
Absolutely. We see Vice President J.D. Vance recently defending new secondary tariffs aimed at India.
Right. And why India? Because India is buying a lot of Russian oil.
Which directly helps fund Moscow's war effort in Ukraine. So by putting tariffs on India, the U.S. aims to make it more expensive for India to keep buying Russian oil, indirectly squeezing Putin's finances.
It's a classic example of this tariff diplomacy in action.
Vance put it very plainly. He said, "The president has applied aggressive economic leverage to make it harder for the Russians to get rich from their oil economy. It fits that Trump strategy to a T."
And it's not just India. The U.S. already has that 54% tariff on China, Russia's top oil customer, and they're hinting at more.
Vance even suggested a kind of dynamic approach. Maybe reduce tariffs if there's progress towards peace, but ramp them up otherwise. Very transactional.
But is it working? The New York Times reports that these measures have slowed down Russian oil profits somewhat, but they certainly haven't stopped the war, now grinding into its third year.
And India's response is interesting, too. Prime Minister Modi publicly calls for diplomacy. But according to the BBC, India keeps buying Russian oil, often at discounted rates. So the effectiveness is still very much being debated.
Let's talk economic impact more broadly. Tariffs do bring in money for the government. Over 5% of U.S. federal income projected for 2025, apparently up from maybe 2% historically.
That's significant revenue. But the flip side is they tend to raise prices for consumers, right? That toy, those sneakers. If they come from a country hit by tariffs, you might pay more at the checkout.
Definitely. But then proponents argue they create jobs domestically. The White House has cited millions of manufacturing jobs added since 2017. It's always this trade-off.
So let's try to sum up the pros and cons of bigger picture effects. On the plus side, tariffs can be a way to deter aggression without putting soldiers in harm's way.
Which has obvious appeal, less boots on the ground.
And in Trump's own words, they're a beautiful thing for negotiation. He'd point to the China trade war leading to that Phase 1 deal, where China promised to buy more U.S. goods.
Even if, as the Peterson Institute noted, compliance with that deal was only partial, it did force them to the table, arguably.
Okay, but the downsides are pretty significant too. Tariffs almost always provoke retaliation.
Like China hitting back with 125% tariffs on U.S. stuff, really hurting American farmers.
Exactly. That tit-for-tat can spiral. And it can slow down global growth overall. The IMF has warned about recession risks linked to the 2025 tariff plans.
It really feels like this high-stakes global game of chicken sometimes. One country raises tariffs,
And the other has to decide, blink or hit back even harder. We saw Trump even pause some tariffs in April 2025 after markets got spooked, showing there's some sensitivity to the fallout.
It keeps everyone on edge, doesn't it? Economists, businesses, us watching it unfold.
And don't forget the legal side. U.S. courts have actually ruled some of these tariffs illegal, like ones imposed under our Emergency Economic Powers Acts, though those cases are often appealed. It adds another layer of uncertainty.
And this strategy isn't just about stopping wars between countries. It's being used for other things too, like border issues.
Right. In February 2025, Trump imposed 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, tied directly to them, curbing fentanyl trafficking and illegal border crossings.
Using economic pressure for a domestic policy goal, almost like using your wallet to build a wall in a way.
And it had an effect, apparently. Mexico deployed troops, and U.S. Customs data showed border crossings drop by 30%. It shows how direct that leverage can feel sometimes.
Of course, there's a huge debate around all this. You've got critics, including, 23 Nobel economists, warning about inflation, rising inequality,
Arguing the costs just fall on regular consumers and businesses.
while supporters will point to job gains in specific sectors, like steel towns, saying it protects American workers and industries.
It seems like a balanced view might be that tariffs can work for specific short-term goals, but they carry this really big risk of long-term isolation if other countries decide to push back hard, form other alliances, or retaliate consistently. Europe's threatened countermeasures, for instance.
So, wrapping this all up, what does it mean? This whole idea of tariff diplomacy is basically a bet. A bet that in our interconnected world, the economic pain of conflict, or even just high tariffs, is too much for countries to bear.
It's turning trade, something usually seen as mutually beneficial, into a potential weapon for peace, or at least for de-escalation, a tool to avoid worse outcomes.
Now, it's definitely not foolproof. History has cautionary tales like the Smoot-Hawley Act back in the 30s.
Oh yeah, that famously made the Great Depression worse by sparking a massive global trade war. So unintended consequences are always a risk.
But maybe today's world is different, so interconnected that this economic pressure just hits harder, carries more weight.
It's possible. It forces nations to calculate the economic costs of conflict much more explicitly.
And whether you're, a farmer worried about retaliation, or just a consumer noticing prices creep up, or someone working in a protected industry, these policies really do touch everyone.
They reshape supply chains, alliances, the flow of goods. It's huge.
The key thing, really, is just to stay informed, because in this day and age, your shopping cart might, in some small way, be connected to global peace efforts or, maybe funding the next trade spat.
It's complex.
So thinking about everything we've discussed, what really stands out to you about how these economic levers are being pulled today? And maybe what future ripple effects should we be watching out for from this, pretty aggressive form of diplomacy? Definitely something to think about.